The loneliest people are not the ones who live alone. They are the ones who believe no one is waiting for them anymore. That thought echoed through my mind as I stood beside my husband's freshly covered grave on a cold October afternoon in Vermont. The wind carried the last golden leaves across the cemetery while friends and neighbors quietly drifted toward their cars. One by one they hugged me, whispered kind words, and promised to visit soon. I thanked every one of them with a polite smile because that was what people expected from a 74-year-old widow who had spent nearly 50 years standing beside the same man. Deep inside, however, I already knew what tomorrow would look like. The flowers would slowly fade. The phone would ring less often. The casseroles would stop arriving. Everyone would return to their own busy lives, and I would return to an empty house where every room still carried my husband's laughter. My son, Michael, gently wrapped his arm around my shoulders and asked if I wanted to come stay with him and his wife for a few days. I shook my head with a soft smile. I told him I would be fine because that was the answer mothers had been giving their children for generations, even when it was not true. Grace stood quietly beside him, holding the wool scarf I had accidentally dropped near the graveside. She brushed a few leaves from it before folding it carefully over her arm. She looked as though she wanted to say something, yet she remained silent, respecting the quiet that surrounded my grief. During the drive home I stared through the passenger window at familiar country roads painted in brilliant shades of red and orange. My husband and I had driven those same roads every autumn for decades, always arguing playfully about which maple tree was the brightest. I caught myself turning toward the empty driver's seat more than once before remembering he was no longer there. The silence inside the car felt heavier than I had ever imagined silence could be. When we reached the farmhouse, Michael carried my overnight bag to the porch even though I had no intention of staying anywhere but home. Grace handed me my scarf with both hands and smiled gently. "If you need absolutely anything, even if it is just someone to drink tea with, please call me," she said. Her voice was warm and sincere, but I simply nodded. I believed she was being kind because kindness was expected on difficult days. I never imagined she truly meant every word. After they drove away, I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house greeted me with perfect stillness. My husband's reading glasses rested exactly where he had left them beside his favorite chair. His coffee mug still sat in the kitchen sink. His gardening gloves remained hanging from the small wooden hook near the back door. Every ordinary object suddenly felt impossible to move because touching them would mean admitting he was not coming back. I slowly walked through each room before stopping in our bedroom. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the quilt we had shared for nearly half a century. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding the wedding ring I had slipped from my finger only an hour earlier. For the first time in many years, the house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a place filled with echoes. Outside, a car slowed briefly in front of the driveway before continuing down the road. I did not know that Grace had almost turned in, carrying something she hoped might comfort me. Instead, she quietly drove away, promising herself she would return another day, even if I never asked her to. The following morning I woke before sunrise, not because I had slept well, but because the silence inside the farmhouse had become impossible to ignore. For nearly 50 years I had grown accustomed to hearing another set of footsteps in the hallway, the familiar sound of coffee brewing before dawn, and my husband humming softly while looking out the kitchen window at the maple trees behind the house. Now every room remained perfectly still. I reached automatically for the second coffee mug before remembering I only needed one. Even that simple realization felt heavier than I expected. After breakfast I wandered into the backyard, pulling my cardigan tighter against the cool autumn air. The vegetable garden my husband had cared for all summer still stood neatly arranged, although the last tomatoes had already begun to disappear with the changing season. I knelt beside the flower bed and absent-mindedly pulled a few weeds, more for something to do than because they truly needed removing. Around mid-morning my phone rang. It was Michael checking to see how I was doing. I assured him I was perfectly fine and even laughed when he asked whether I had remembered to eat breakfast. Mothers become very good at protecting their children from worry, even after those children have gray hairs of their own. Before hanging up, he mentioned that Grace wanted to stop by later in the afternoon. I politely thanked him but quietly suggested it was unnecessary. She has enough responsibilities already, I said. She does not need to spend her free time looking after an old woman. Michael hesitated for a moment before simply replying, "She wants to come because she cares, Mom." I smiled politely, yet after the call ended I whispered to myself that kindness often fades once life returns to normal. Around 3 o'clock I heard a gentle knock at the front door. Standing on the porch was Grace holding a homemade apple pie wrapped carefully in a blue kitchen towel. A paper bag rested beside it, and the warm scent of cinnamon drifted through the crisp afternoon air. "I remembered you once said your husband loved apple pie after the first cold weekend of fall," she said with a soft smile. "I thought maybe we could have a slice together." For a brief second I considered telling her I was tired and preferred to be alone. Instead, something in her eyes reminded me of the quiet sincerity she had shown at the cemetery. I stepped aside and invited her in. We sat at the old oak kitchen table where my husband and I had shared thousands of meals. Grace poured tea without asking where anything belonged, somehow already knowing exactly which cups I always used for guests. We talked about ordinary things at first. The changing leaves. The local farmer's market. Her students decorating pumpkins for Halloween. She never asked me to talk about my grief. She simply allowed silence to exist whenever it arrived. As the afternoon sunlight stretched across the kitchen floor, I realized nearly 2 hours had passed without either of us noticing. Before leaving, Grace quietly washed the dishes we had used and folded the dish towel exactly the way my husband used to. I stood in the doorway watching her walk toward her car with the empty pie plate tucked beneath one arm. For the first time since the funeral, the house did not feel quite as empty after someone left. I told myself it was only because I had enjoyed the company. Deep inside, however, another feeling had begun to grow, one I had not allowed myself to feel in a very long time. It felt remarkably similar to hope. Grace's visits slowly became part of the rhythm of my week, although neither of us ever spoke about making them a routine. She never arrived with the energy of someone trying to solve my loneliness. Instead, she simply appeared with small reasons to stop by. One afternoon it was a loaf of freshly baked bread that she insisted was too large for just 2 people at her house. Another day it was a basket of flower bulbs because she said she had bought more than she needed. I recognized the excuses for what they were, but I appreciated that she offered them without making me feel like someone who needed rescuing. As October gave way to November, the farmhouse gradually felt less silent whenever she was there. We spent one rainy afternoon sorting through old recipe cards in my kitchen. Many of them had belonged to my mother before they became mine. The edges had softened with age, and small stains of flour and vanilla marked recipes that had been made countless times over the decades. Grace picked up one faded card and smiled when she noticed the handwritten note in the corner. "Best served on the first snowy day," she read aloud. I laughed for the first time in weeks. "My husband wrote that after claiming every pie tasted better when snow was falling," I said. Grace carefully placed the card back into the box as though it were something precious. She never rushed me when memories surfaced. She simply listened. Later that afternoon she offered to help organize a few storage boxes in the upstairs attic before winter arrived. I almost refused out of habit, but I found myself saying yes before I could change my mind. The attic had remained untouched since my husband passed away. Dust-covered old trunks, holiday decorations, and shelves filled with decades of family history. Sunlight slipped through the small window beneath the roof, filling the room with a warm golden glow despite the cold air outside. Together we opened one weathered cedar chest after another. Inside were children's drawings Michael had made in elementary school, old Christmas ornaments wrapped in newspaper, and photographs from family vacations beside Lake Champlain. We smiled quietly as each forgotten memory returned to life. Then Grace reached toward a small wooden box tucked behind a stack of quilts. She looked at me before opening it, silently asking permission. I nodded. Inside lay dozens of neatly folded envelopes tied together with a pale blue ribbon. Every envelope carried my husband's name written in my own handwriting. Grace looked at me with gentle surprise but did not ask a single question. I slowly picked up the bundle, running my fingers across the familiar paper. "I wrote these after he passed," I whispered. "Whenever I missed him, I wrote another letter because I did not know what else to do with everything I still wanted to say." The room fell completely silent. Grace carefully sat beside me on the old wooden floor without speaking. She did not offer comforting words or tell me everything would be all right. She simply remained there, allowing me to hold those letters for as long as I needed. After several quiet minutes she finally smiled and said, "Would you ever like someone to hear those stories?" I looked down at the ribbon wrapped around the letters, unsure whether I was ready to answer. Yet somewhere deep inside, a small part of me wondered if perhaps those pages had been waiting for someone exactly like her all along. For several days the bundle of letters remained on my living room table exactly where Grace and I had left it. Each time I walked past, I paused for a moment before continuing on with whatever small task I had found to fill another quiet afternoon. I had written every one of those letters believing no one would ever read them. They were conversations with the man I had loved for nearly 50 years, words that had nowhere else to go after he was gone. On the following Thursday, Grace stopped by carrying 2 steaming cups of hot chocolate instead of tea. She smiled when she noticed the letters had not moved. "There is no hurry," she said gently. "Some stories wait until they know they are safe." Her words settled softly in my heart. We sat together beside the fireplace while rain tapped lightly against the windows. After a long silence, I reached for the first envelope and carefully unfolded the pages. My voice trembled through the opening lines, but Grace never interrupted. The letter described an ordinary Sunday morning years earlier when my husband had insisted on dancing with me in the kitchen while pancakes burned on the stove. We laughed so hard that breakfast became almost impossible to save. By the time I finished reading, I realized I was smiling through tears instead of hiding from them. Grace smiled too, not because the story was extraordinary, but because she understood that ordinary moments often become the memories we treasure most. We continued with another letter. This one told the story of the tiny apple tree my husband planted shortly after Michael was born. He had joked that whichever grew faster, the tree or our son, would owe the other an apology. Grace laughed quietly, then looked out the window toward the backyard where that same tree still stood, its branches now stretching high above the fence. "Some promises keep growing even after the people who made them are gone," she whispered. I looked at her with quiet surprise. She always seemed to know exactly the right thing to say without trying to sound wise. As the afternoon faded into evening, the letters slowly transformed from reminders of loss into celebrations of a life well lived. Each page brought another memory back into the room, and somehow the house felt warmer than it had in months. Before leaving, Grace carefully tied the blue ribbon back around the stack of envelopes and placed them inside the wooden box. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Thank you for trusting me with those memories," she said. I lowered my eyes and smiled softly. "I thought I was protecting them by keeping them hidden," I admitted. "Maybe I was only protecting myself from feeling them again." Grace reached over and gently squeezed my hand. It was such a simple gesture that it almost caught me off guard. There was no pity in her expression, only quiet understanding. After she drove away, I remained beside the fireplace holding the first letter. For the first time since my husband's funeral, I no longer felt as though I was speaking only to someone who was gone. Somehow those memories had found a new place to live. As I placed the letters back into the cedar box, I noticed one envelope tucked beneath the others that looked different from the rest. My handwriting was on the front, but the envelope had never been sealed. I could not remember writing it, and I suddenly found myself wondering what forgotten words were waiting inside. That evening I carried the unopened envelope downstairs and placed it on the kitchen table, but I could not bring myself to open it. I made a cup of chamomile tea, wrapped both hands around the warm mug, and watched the first snowflakes of the season drift quietly past the window. The farmhouse looked peaceful beneath the fading light, yet my thoughts kept returning to that single envelope. I knew my own handwriting. I remembered writing every letter after my husband passed away, yet this one seemed strangely unfamiliar. The following afternoon Grace arrived with a basket of fresh cranberry muffins still warm from the oven. She noticed the envelope almost immediately but said nothing. Instead, she helped me arrange the muffins on a plate before lighting the small candle that always sat in the middle of the kitchen table. Its gentle glow softened the room, making the old house feel welcoming again. After we sat down, I finally picked up the envelope and smiled nervously. I honestly do not remember writing this one, I admitted. Grace simply nodded. Sometimes our hearts remember things before our minds are ready, she said quietly. Taking a slow breath, I unfolded the letter. The date at the top surprised me. It had been written only 3 weeks after my husband's funeral. My own words greeted me like the voice of a stranger. I had written about the fear of growing old alone. I had confessed that I worried my son would eventually become too busy to visit and that I never wanted my family to feel responsible for me. Near the bottom of the page I had written something that made my eyes fill with tears. If life ever brings another woman into this family who chooses kindness instead of obligation, I hope I will have the courage to welcome her as my own. I stopped reading. The room became completely still. Grace looked at me with quiet surprise, but she did not speak. Neither of us seemed able to find the right words. I lowered the letter into my lap and laughed softly through my tears. I had forgotten I ever wrote that, I whispered. Perhaps I was writing to the future without realizing it. Grace reached across the table and gently covered my hand with hers. Maybe your heart already knew what it needed, she replied. We remained there for several minutes, saying nothing at all. Outside, the snow continued falling, covering the garden my husband had once cared for so faithfully. For the first time, that beautiful silence no longer reminded me of everything I had lost. Instead, it reminded me that life still had room for new memories. Before leaving that afternoon, Grace carried the empty teacups to the sink while I carefully returned the letter to its envelope. As I placed it back inside the cedar box, something slipped from between the folded pages and floated gently onto the floor. Grace bent down to pick it up before I could. It was an old photograph I had completely forgotten existed. The picture showed a much younger version of me standing beside my husband on the front porch, smiling as we welcomed Michael and a teenage Grace into our home for the very first Thanksgiving after they became engaged. Grace stared at the photograph for a long moment before looking back at me. I have never seen this picture before, she whispered. Neither had I, and somehow it felt as though that forgotten moment had been waiting all these years for us to discover it together. The photograph stayed on my kitchen counter for the next several days, and every time I walked past it, I found myself stopping for a little while. It showed 4 smiling faces standing on the front porch many years earlier. My husband stood proudly beside me with one hand resting on Michael's shoulder, while Grace stood quietly at his side, still a young woman who had only recently become part of our family. Looking at that picture now, I realized I had spent years remembering that Thanksgiving as the day my son introduced the woman he loved. I had never stopped to wonder what that day had meant to Grace. When she visited again the following weekend, I handed her the photograph. She smiled softly before tracing the edge of the picture with her fingertips. I remember this day, she said. I was terrified. I looked at her with surprise. Terrified? I asked. She nodded with a quiet laugh. I had lost my mother when I was 11 years old. After that, every holiday felt different. When Michael invited me to meet all of you, I kept wondering whether I would ever feel like I truly belonged in another family. Her words settled over me like the first snowfall covering an empty field. I had never known that part of her story. Grace had always carried herself with such quiet confidence that I assumed she had grown up surrounded by warmth and certainty. She looked toward the photograph again before continuing. Do you know what I remember most about that day? She asked. I slowly shook my head. She smiled through eyes that had suddenly become bright with emotion. You noticed I looked nervous before dinner. You walked into the kitchen, handed me your apron, and asked if I would help you make the mashed potatoes. Everyone else thought we were cooking, but really you were helping me breathe. I searched my memory until the moment finally returned. I remembered placing an apron over her shoulders and telling her that nobody who peeled potatoes in my kitchen ever had to feel like a guest. At the time it had seemed like such an ordinary thing to say. Grace quietly laughed. You probably forgot those words the next day, she said. I never did. I felt my eyes fill with tears as I realized how often the smallest acts of kindness become the biggest memories in someone else's life. We sat together in comfortable silence before Grace finally spoke again. After my mother passed away, I spent years wishing I could ask someone simple questions. How long should I bake a pie? Which flowers bloom first in spring? What do you do when your heart feels too heavy? I missed having someone to call for those little things. I reached across the table without thinking and gently took her hand. There was no hesitation this time. No invisible distance between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. Only two women who had both spent years carrying quiet losses in different ways. Grace smiled gently and whispered, I never wanted to replace anyone. I only hoped that maybe, someday, we could choose each other. Those words stayed with me long after she had gone home that evening. Standing alone at the kitchen window, I looked once more at the old photograph and realized something I had never understood before. While I believed I had been slowly losing my family after becoming a widow, someone else had quietly been hoping to become part of it all along. The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving passed more quickly than either of us expected. Almost without noticing, Grace and I had settled into a gentle routine that felt as natural as the changing seasons outside my window. She no longer knocked timidly at the front door. She would call out softly before stepping inside, carrying fresh bread, grocery bags, or simply a warm smile. Sometimes we spent hours talking. Other times we worked side by side in comfortable silence, each of us understanding that not every meaningful moment required words. One chilly Tuesday afternoon Michael stopped by unexpectedly after work. He stood quietly in the kitchen doorway watching Grace and me roll pie dough across the old wooden table dusted with flour. We were laughing over my failed attempt to teach her the exact way my mother used to crimp the edges of an apple pie. I had not realized he had been standing there until he smiled and said, I have not heard this house sound this alive in a long time. Grace looked slightly embarrassed and brushed a little flour from her sweater. I simply smiled back because he was right. The house no longer echoed with emptiness. It echoed with conversation, laughter, and the ordinary sounds of life returning one day at a time. Later that evening, after Grace had gone home, Michael remained behind to help me carry firewood onto the porch. As we stacked the logs together beneath the fading autumn sky, he became unusually quiet. Finally he looked toward the backyard before speaking. Mom, he said softly, there is something I have wanted to tell you. I waited patiently. Grace has been coming here every week for much longer than you probably realize. I looked at him with surprise. Since when? I asked. He smiled gently. Since Dad became sick. My hands stopped moving. Michael explained that during the months when hospital visits and doctor appointments filled our days, Grace often came by while I was away. She mowed the lawn, stocked the pantry, folded laundry, and quietly repaired little things around the house. Whenever I thanked Michael afterward, believing he had taken care of everything, he never corrected me because Grace had asked him not to. She never wanted you to feel like you owed her anything, he said. She just wanted to make life a little easier. I felt my eyes fill with tears once again, but this time they came from a place far different than grief. I thought back over countless little kindnesses I had overlooked. Fresh flowers that somehow always appeared on the dining table. The porch railing that no longer squeaked. The bird feeder mysteriously filled every few days. I had assumed those things simply happened because generous people often fail to notice who quietly serves them. Michael smiled with quiet pride. She has always admired you, he continued. She once told me that if she could become even half the woman she believed you were, she would consider her life successful. I lowered my head because I had spent so much time worrying about becoming a burden that I had completely failed to notice someone had already chosen to love me without obligation. That night, before going to bed, I walked through every room of the farmhouse with fresh eyes. Everywhere I looked, I found small reminders of Grace's quiet care. None of them asked for recognition. None expected praise. They were simply expressions of love, patiently given long before I was ready to receive them. Standing beside the kitchen window, I whispered into the peaceful darkness that perhaps families are not held together by grand declarations, but by countless invisible acts of kindness that slowly teach two hearts they have belonged together all along. Thanksgiving morning arrived wrapped in fresh snow, turning the little farmhouse into the kind of picture my husband had always loved. The maple trees stood quietly beneath white branches, smoke drifted gently from neighboring chimneys, and the kitchen slowly filled with familiar aromas that had welcomed our family every November for decades. This year, however, something felt different. For the first time since becoming a widow, I woke with anticipation instead of heaviness. Grace arrived just after sunrise wearing the same apron I had given her years earlier during that unforgettable first Thanksgiving after she became engaged to Michael. The fabric had faded slightly with time, but she still wore it with the same gentle smile. We prepared dinner side by side exactly as we had done so many times before, although this time I noticed how naturally we moved around one another. She already knew where every mixing bowl belonged. She reached for the cinnamon before I asked. She laughed when I pretended to guard my secret pie crust recipe, reminding me that I had accidentally taught it to her years ago without realizing it. By early afternoon the house was filled with family, warm conversation, and the comforting sounds of children laughing in the next room. Michael carved the turkey while everyone gathered around the long dining table that my husband had built by hand nearly 30 years earlier. Before anyone began eating, Michael quietly stood and lifted his glass. Dad always believed Thanksgiving was about gratitude for the people who make a house feel like home, he said. Today I would like to thank someone who has quietly done that for all of us. He turned toward Grace, smiling with unmistakable pride. You have spent years taking care of this family without ever asking for recognition. Dad would have been incredibly proud of you. Grace lowered her eyes, clearly embarrassed by the attention. She softly replied that she had only done what any family member would do. I looked around the table and realized everyone was watching her with genuine affection. Without planning to, I stood from my chair. My heart pounded faster than it had in years, yet the words seemed to find me on their own. I walked around the table until I stood beside Grace. Gently placing one hand over hers, I smiled through grateful tears. For a very long time, I said quietly, I believed my family was growing smaller. I was wrong. It was quietly growing larger. The room became completely still. I took a slow breath before continuing. You have never treated me like an obligation. You have never made me feel forgotten. You chose to love me even when I did not know how to accept it. Grace's eyes filled with tears as she looked up at me. I smiled and softly said the words that had been waiting inside my heart for months. I know everyone calls you my daughter-in-law. But in my heart, you are simply my daughter. Grace covered her face for a moment before wrapping her arms around me in the warmest embrace I had felt since my husband was still alive. Around us, no one spoke. No one needed to. The silence itself carried more love than any speech ever could. Later that evening, after the dishes had been washed and the guests had begun saying goodbye, I walked into the living room and opened the small cedar cabinet where our family's keepsakes had always been stored. Resting inside was a tiny velvet box that I had not touched since the day my husband passed away. I held it gently in my hands, knowing with complete certainty that the time had finally come to place it into someone else's. After everyone had gone home that Thanksgiving evening, the farmhouse became quiet once again, but it was no longer the kind of silence that made the rooms feel empty. It was the peaceful silence that follows a day filled with love. I carried the small velvet box into the kitchen where Grace was carefully drying the last dinner plate. She looked up with a curious smile as I placed the box between us on the table. For a moment I simply rested my hand on the worn velvet, remembering the afternoon my husband had slipped the ring onto my finger more than 50 years earlier. Together we had built a home, raised a son, weathered difficult seasons, celebrated joyful ones, and learned that the strongest families are shaped by ordinary days lived with extraordinary devotion. Slowly I opened the box. Inside rested my wedding ring beside another small treasure, my mother's handwritten recipe book bound together with faded blue ribbon. Grace immediately shook her head. "I cannot accept those," she whispered. I smiled gently because I had expected that answer. "You are not accepting them," I replied softly. "You are continuing their story." I lifted the recipe book first and placed it into her hands. The pages were worn from decades of holiday meals, birthday cakes, Sunday dinners, and quiet evenings when cooking together had been another way of saying I love you. "Every woman in my family added something to this book," I told her. "Today it becomes yours. Someday you will add your own recipes, your own memories, and perhaps one day someone else will continue after you." Tears quietly rolled down Grace's cheeks as she carefully turned the first page. Then I picked up the wedding ring and held it in my palm. This ring reminded me every day that love is not measured by how long someone lives beside us. It is measured by how faithfully we choose each other while we have the chance. I gently closed her fingers around it. "Keep it until the day your own granddaughter asks what lasting love looks like. Then tell her our story." Grace could no longer hold back her tears. She embraced me with both arms, and for the first time since losing my husband, I realized I no longer felt like the last remaining branch on an old family tree. New branches had been quietly growing all around me. The years continued to pass. Every Thanksgiving our family gathered around the same wooden table. The farmhouse echoed once again with laughter. Children running through the hallway, pies cooling on the windowsill, and familiar recipes filling the kitchen with comforting aromas. Grace eventually taught the younger generation how to make my mother's apple pie exactly as I had once taught her. Sometimes she smiled and intentionally left a little flour on the counter because she said every real family kitchen should look as though love had been busy there. On quiet afternoons we still sat together on the front porch watching autumn leaves drift across the yard where my husband had once planted the little apple tree. It had grown tall enough to shade nearly half the garden. One evening my youngest granddaughter climbed onto my lap and innocently asked whether Grace had always been my daughter. I smiled, looked toward Grace standing beneath the old tree, and answered with complete certainty. "No, sweetheart. Life gave me something even more beautiful. It gave me the chance to choose her, and it gave her the chance to choose me." As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the Vermont hills, I realized that families are not always born in a single moment. Sometimes they are patiently built through thousands of quiet acts of kindness until one day you look across the table and understand that the person you never gave birth to has become the daughter your heart had been waiting for all along.